Hi Oscar. I'm going to walk you through the steps of cleaning the airbrush, but instead of using the one that I did when you were here in the studio, this is my Iwata TR1 trigger action. And I paint with this because it's much more comfortable to work with. Basically the mechanics, as you saw when I took it apart, are very similar to yours. But because it's a trigger action, the cleaning is just slightly different. So I'd rather show you on my Olympus Micron, which is much similar in design to your airbrush, and it has a built-in color cup. We'll put this one aside. I love it. It's a beautiful airbrush. And we'll jump into the Micron. It's also made, it's called the Olympus Micron, but it's made by Iwata. And I put that on the trigger because when I'm painting for hours on end, that metal trigger bothers my finger. So a little piece of leather glued onto the surface prevents that. Let's take it apart. Like your airbrush, I unscrew the back part, and that exposes the needle lock and the needle. This is the head assembly, which is different than yours. My head assembly comes totally apart. The needle cap unscrews, and basically its purpose is to protect the needle. See that little fine needle? I don't know if the video picks it up. You can paint with the needle cap removed, but you run the risk of damaging the needle if you touch what you're painting, so I recommend you keep the needle cap on. The first thing I like to do before I take off the head assembly is I loosen the needle nut over here and I pull the needle back. I retract it so it doesn't get damaged. Now I unscrew the head assembly, take the whole thing off because I want to clean it out. I do this every time I use the airbrush. Cleaning is critical. Now I push the needle forward. I don't pull it back. I push it forward. I don't want to drag any paint that might be on the needle into the trigger mechanism. So I pull the needle out very carefully, put it on my soft tray, and now I basically have all the parts removed. It's even possible to remove this from the airbrush. The spring guide that's in here. But you're getting a little bit more complicated than you need to right now. I recommend you leave all of this in place. If you pull your needle forward, not pull it back, it should remain relatively clean. Also, the reason why I'm showing you on the Micron is because the trigger, you don't want to inadvertently pull it out. If you pull it out of the air piston that's in here, it can be put easily back in, but it's a pain in the neck. So keep that in place. Put it down. Now I'm assuming that you have run cleaning, you've cleaned out your airbrush, you've plugged it into your cleaning jar or whatever it is you have to clean it, or you brought it over to a sink and you flushed it out in the sink, so you've cleaned it out that way. And between color changes, that's all you have to do. You don't have to take your airbrush apart between color changes. Just flush out the color cup with clean water and do it until the spray comes out clean and you're good to go. This is totally apart now. Lay it on the side, and with a little of your cleaning fluid, remember what I showed you, how I make mine. It's 1/3 distilled water, 1/3 isopropyl alcohol, and I usually use 91% isopropyl alcohol, and 1/3 windshield washer fluid. Mix that in a gallon jug, and I have plenty of inexpensive cleaning fluid. So I clean down my needle, and I always pull it backwards because I don't want to damage that tip. You don't want to push it forward ever. Just clean it that way. My head assembly comes totally apart, and there is the, right there, you see that? That's very tiny, the fluid nozzle. and you have one in your airbrush, I think it might be built into your head assembly. I wasn't sure as to the configuration. What you can do, with a little bit more cleaning fluid, squirt it through that. Make sure there's no debris in it. Gently wipe it with a tissue. Make sure there's no paint buildup on your fluid nozzle. The way I like to clean the needle cap is with this little tool I made, and I showed you as you're painting you could use that tool to clean your needle very gently. It's very safe to use. So just make sure these are 100% clean. Get any dried paint. In fact, there shouldn't be any dried paint on it. The top part. Now, this might be a little different than yours. What I do with this when I reassemble it is I coat it with a little bit of sealing wax. Actually, I'm using something rather fancy. It's called disclosing wax. It's actually some jewelry stuff that I had laying around, but I find it very effective for this. You have to seal the threads. I find that little air leaks in the airbrush can wreak havoc. And this is a very good wax to use. Kerr disclosing wax, and I buy it on a website called Contenti, CONTENTI.com. If I was to remove that mechanism, I would use a wrench made by Iwata. Now, I'm just showing you this. I know you don't have this tool, but I'll show you how I would remove this air cap. It may help you understand how this works. I just give it a little twist and then very carefully remove it. And the nozzle is removed from the air cap. See that? Look at that, it's so tiny. Got to be careful. And the way I clean that, if I ever need to clean it, is I actually sharpen a toothpick, very fine point on a wooden toothpick, and all I do is put that in there, kind of turn it around. Very gentle. I don't force anything, and it has a little bit of the cleaning fluid on it, and I remove it. And often, if there's a little paint in there, that will remove the paint. Put that back on. Now I realize this doesn't apply to your airbrush, but knowing this kind of stuff can help. Now what I'll do is put that back in my fancy cleaning tool and screw it back in. Now, however, you know, if you can remove yours, the only tip I can give you with removing yours, because I forget how it was attached to your head assembly, is don't over tighten anything. Give it a little turn, not even, just a little pressure. That's all it needs. And I'll screw in this part of the head assembly. Okay, so that's that. Now, with this cleaned, and I've cleaned it with the same solution, the cleaning fluid solution, I always like to put a drop of oil on that. Oil specifically designed for the airbrush, and you may have some oil that came along with your airbrush kit. I use Iwata lubricant. I think Badger also makes a lubricant that could be used for any airbrush. Then what I do is I rub it back and forth, and I take a Kleenex and I wipe it off. There'll still be a little residual on it, but most is removed. Now to put the needle back in, you can put it in this way, but I prefer to put it through the back, because I feel in the airbrush everything should be moving forward, not backwards. So before I insert the needle, the next thing to do is screw back the head assembly. With my airbrush, I always coat the threads. It's kind of like putting pipe thread sealant onto your plumbing fixtures. And I'll screw that head assembly back on. Notice I'm not using pliers to tighten anything. I get a hand grip, tighten it that way. If you do use a pair of pliers to tighten anything, make sure they're designed to be used with the airbrush. Now, I don't have any pliers that are designed to be used with the airbrush, so I got myself a regular pair of pliers. It's relatively small, and I glued leather to the jaws of the plier so I don't damage the airbrush parts. And there's always the risk of over tightening when you use pliers and damaging your airbrush, so that's why I don't recommend it. But you shouldn't have to use pliers. To reinsert the needle, what you want to do is to press the lever trigger. That's why I wanted to show you with this. You have to push that trigger down. Take it, and gently, don't force anything. If you feel any resistance, stop. Push it through. And when it stops, and you can see now it's poking out the tip, it's fully inserted. You don't want to put pressure on it because you could damage the fluid nozzle at the tip. You no longer have to keep the trigger down. You can release it and tighten it. And that's it. Now, there's just one thing I need to tell you. If you're painting and you're seeing a lot of bubbles coming up in your airbrush, you're not getting any spray and it's bubbling, or you're getting a little spray and it's bubbling, what does that mean? It means that something is loose here. As soon as you have an air leak at the tip, and it could simply require just make sure everything is tight, that will solve it. It's a problem that can drive you nuts if you don't realize that all it is something loose in the front. So you just tighten it, and that's why I use this, because it seals the threads and totally prevents any kind of bubbling of stuff in the front. Okay, Oscar, that's the basics. I wish I had your airbrush to demonstrate on. Maybe I'll get one down the road, so if you have any questions, I can dissect it, and it'll make much more sense. But anyway, I hope this helps.